We have something a bit different for our last episode of 2023. We've invited a couple friends to join us to talk about the buildings we lost, the ones we're saved, and what we should keep an eye on in 2024. So I'm Wendy.
I'm Chris.
And this is Demolished Salt Lake and preservation wins, losses, and what to watch in 2024. Hello and welcome to episode 31. We're excited to have Rachel Quist join us today. Rachel, would you please introduce yourself to the fine folks?
Hi, I'm Rachel. I am a professional archaeologist living in Salt Lake City, and I write and research for Rachel's SLC History. You can find me on Instagram or my website, slchistory.org.
Awesome. Our friend Adrienne White of House Genealogy was going to join us today, but unfortunately she's under the weather, so we wish her a fast recovery. All right, we have quite a list.
We do. It's going to take some getting through.
Stick with us. We promise. This is an important discussion when it comes to historic preservation. So let's dive in. All right. Let's start on buildings we've lost so that we can end on a happy note.
I agree.
Okay. So the first house that we have on our list is the Pink House. And this was at 666 East, 300 South. It was built in 1899. It was built for Stephen Covey. And the architect was the same architect for the McHugh Mansion, which is kind of cool.
Yeah.
It was located, this is important, because it was located in the Central City Historic District. And Chris, can you tell us a little bit about what that means to be in a historic district?
Well, and let's make a distinction that it was the local historic district.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, just so everybody knows, a National Historic District is honorary only. It only gives you tax incentives through the federal government to restore your historic homes or buildings. So whenever you hear a National Historic District or homes on the National Historic Register, it's really just honorary. This, however, was in a local historic district, which provides a plethora of protections around the exterior of the buildings and what people can do to alter them. It usually stops a building from being demolished, especially if it's contributing.
Right.
This building, I believe, was contributing.
It was, yes. I read through the historic district documents, and it was considered contributing.
Yeah. This is a really sad tale. I mean, this sat vacant for years. I've moved back in Salt Lake in 2001, and I remember seeing it then, and I believe it was vacant then. And it always caught my eye because it was just such a unique home sitting there by itself.
Right.
Well, and you can tell that it was important to the neighborhood just because we can say the Pink House.
Yes.
And people know what we're talking about.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Yes. So, unfortunately, it was in pretty bad shape.
Yeah.
And we call that, I learned this from Rachel, we call that demolition by neglect. And it had sat way too long. It was in really rough shape. And then it experienced a fire earlier this year. And because of that fire, the owners put in for an emergency demolition.
Because of safety.
Because of safety.
We should have a new term for Salt Lake City, demolition by suspicious fire.
Oh, seriously, yes.
You know, I was thinking the same thing. Because this is happening quite a bit. But I did some researching last week on this because it popped up that a Canadian city has had multiple fires also with historic buildings or buildings that they were wanting to have replaced and tore down and couldn't get permits. And apparently, when I started digging into it, it's happening all across the country right now.
It is, yes. If you follow us on Twitter, I think it was back last year, we had quite a discussion with a few of our Twitter followers about this. And I did a little research and found out that, it's not just here. It actually is a thing.
Yeah, it's a little weird it's happening in 2023 and will probably continue to happen in 2024, especially with how many cameras there are out there in the world. You think people would catch on that this isn't probably a smart way to go.
Right.
It's really weird.
So unfortunately for the Pink House, it was granted a demolition, and it has since been demolished.
Quickly. It was within a week or two, wasn't it?
Yeah, we couldn't keep up
Yeah.
with getting pictures. Rachel, you went and got some pictures during the demolition.
Yeah, I happened to be running errands in the area, and I missed my turn, so I just needed to go around the block. And then all of a sudden, I see the Pink House is being demolished. So I get out of my car and start taking some photos and videos. And I wasn't the only one doing that. I met several other people who came up during and right after, and they would talk about the house. One person had lived in the house in the 80s.
Oh, no way. Probably one of the last people to live in the house.
So, yeah, people would tell me their stories about the house. So, again, that just reinforces that it had its own sense of place in the community. Right. And people identified with that house as a local landmark. Right,
yeah. And it's an important idea of this sense of place and local landmarks, right?
Yeah, and that house stood out too because of its unique roof line. I can't remember if it was a mansard roof or if it was a, what's the other roof style I'm thinking of? Not colonial. It's not Norwegian. It'll come to me later.
All right.
But it was a unique roof line for that neighborhood. There wasn't any other roof line
like it. It really was, and
yeah.
I think that's what stood out to me too, aside from being pink.
Yeah.
The only pink in the whole area, right? So, yeah, I think we weren't the only ones that were displeased with seeing that go away. All right, so next on the list we have very recent. We have the Yardstick Building, and it was at 52 East Broadway, and this was built in 1908. And Rachel, you did some really deep dives on the history.
I did.
So this is another building that unfortunately has stood empty for, again, probably decades.
Yeah, I was talking to another person about the history of the Yardstick Building, and I had gone through all the history, which I'll tell you a little bit about in a minute, but she had identified that space as Justice for Bernardo,
yeah.
Thank you, because that's where a large mural had been painted. And so people have recently identified it as a community art space, a community political action space. And so even though it was an abandoned building, it still resonated with people in the neighborhood.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now, the origin story of the Yardstick Building has to do with Jewish history in Salt Lake, which has a fairly long history. And that whole section of 300 South is what I call a Jewish corridor. Mm. So it was a woman who had built that home, and that building. Her name is Evelyn Brooks Auerbach.
Auerbach, yeah.
So she united two of the main pioneer Jewish families of Salt Lake City. The Brooks family, which is now mostly known as the Brooks Arcade Building, which it is still standing. Well, the facade.
Yeah.
Is still standing. And then the Auerbach family, which is primarily known for the Auerbach shopping.
The department store.
Yeah. Yes. And people who remember old Salt Lake, like from the 50s and 60s, they will tell you stories about having to dress up to go shop at Auerbach's. You would wear your furs, is what one lady told me.
Yes.
It was a high-end department store, and it was an event to go there. So this lady, Evelyn Brooks Auerbach, she is the one who built the Yardstick Building. It wasn't her husband. It wasn't her father. It was her. So it's like Jewish women's history all wrapped up into this building, which is why I think it's an amazing story.
I didn't know it was considered a Jewish corridor, but now it makes sense because the B'nai Israel Temple is on 3rd South and 4th East. And so that's 5200 East Broadway.
Yeah, it's not too far away.
It's not too far away. Yeah, it's right in that area.
Yeah, the Brooks family was one of the first. Well, they were the first Jewish family to settle in Salt Lake. There had been individuals who had come, but as far as the first family, they came in 1864. The Brooks family is pretty amazing too because the mother, Fanny, she stood up to Brigham Young during those pioneer days where Brigham Young was in charge. He had put out a moratorium to the followers of the LDS faith that they were not to shop at any place unless it was owned by a Mormon. So it was to emphasize the Mormon settlement of the valley, and it was against the Gentiles.
Right.
So Gentile meaning non-Mormon, to include Jewish people. Now, Fanny wasn't going to have any of this.
Good old Fanny.
She, again, not her husband, but Fanny, sought audience with Brigham Young, who did see her, and she told him, and this is all outlined in her autobiography, that they had been good neighbors. They had faithfully been paying their tithing. Now, tithing being a Mormon-only contribution, but as a Jewish family that settled, they had been paying their tithing to the Mormon church as well. And she convinced Brigham Young that they could be part of this Mormon shopping emphasis.
That's amazing.
Yeah. And that's all in that property between State Street and 2nd East.
Yeah.
Wow.
On 300 South. And that's why I call it a Jewish corridor.
Makes sense.
That's an interesting history that she went to Brigham Young. It made me think of a few things because Brigham Young, when the valley was settled, he talked a lot about wanting the Mormons to be self-reliant. So I think that sort of falls in that narrative where he wanted like their own like microeconomy, and he didn't really want like the railroad to come through here and several other things. And so that sort of fits into that narrative of like sort of like a Mormon utopia is what he really wanted.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's also a bit strange because it made me, as you were talking about that, how he was trying to like lock out the Jewish families from participating in that, or store owners, that, you know, it's such a weird... When I think of like the Mormons and the Jewish people today, I hear so many Mormon leaders talk about how their struggle is similar to the Jewish struggle. Like they really tie themselves into that narrative. And it makes me wonder, when did that narrative change? Because it's just such an interesting... I've always thought it was so interesting.
Right. Well, there is that tie in Mormon theology that they're considered one of the lost tribes of Israel. Mm-hmm. So there is always has been that affinity towards the Jewish people, kind of like we're cousins.
Yeah, but at some point in history, it becomes a narrative that's like widely spread, and that's what I'm getting at. Is, you know, when did that really become like a huge narrative that it is? Because it's really big now, still to this day. So yeah, it's just interesting. The Yardstick too was, you know, you did a post on this, Wendy.
Yeah.
You did a lot of research on the Yardstick Building too, and you know, the theater was already gone, and that was demolished in the 50s?
The 40s, I believe. Yeah, there was a lot of people that were having a hard time distinguishing between the Victory Theater and the Yardstick Building.
Yeah.
The Victory Theater was behind the Yardstick Building in an attached building.
Yeah, it was built at the same time.
They were built at the same time. You entered into the Victory Theater through the lobby of at this time it was a mixed use building, hotel on top and storefront on the bottom.
And by hotel you got to think more like a boarding house.
Right. And this is something I've come to learn a lot about. There was a lot of hotels in Salt Lake, starting like when Salt Lake really started being built. But you're right, it was more of like a boarding house. You paid maybe daily or weekly, but you lived there. That was your home.
Yes, and you'll see in the old directories, rather than giving an address, some people just state the hotel that they live at. And it would be convenient because you would have your maid service.
Right.
Sometimes you may have a shared bathroom, sometimes not. It depends. And then you would just go and get your meals from a local restaurant.
Right. Right. So that was what was going on at the time. And then unfortunately the I'm having a little bit of a talking issue today. The Victory Theater, it did burn down, and Chris and I are actually going to do an episode about the Auerbach family and really kind of deep dive that. So we'll get to that. So stay tuned for that, about the Victory Theater and the fire.
And also to add to the confusion.
Yes.
The Victory Theater also went by other names, including the Colonial Theater. It then became the Pantages Theater, which confuses so many people because there was another Pantages Theater. And then Lowe's State Theater, and then finally it became the Victory Theater in 1924.
Almost every theater in town had multiple names too.
Yeah.
And some of them had the same name.
Yes, it's so confusing.
It is really confusing. So anyway, the theater was demolished way back after the fire. So there was a lot of posts about, the city was going to demolish this historic theater.
Yes.
And it was not the theater. That theater has long gone.
Yeah, and it's important that I thought it was very important that you address that, because there was a couple accounts that were spreading that are actually popular accounts.
Right.
And it just wasn't true.
And even a local weekly newspaper did an article about it.
And didn't do their research.
Yeah. And so I think it's really important when we talk about demolishing a historic building to get the history right, because the narrative matters in the hype.
Yes.
When, we've, a lot of stuff about the Utah Theater, right? And so now I think when people hear historic theater being demolished, it's a completely different discussion. Like another historic theater, and especially when the name Pantages was attached to it.
Right.
Yeah. Well, this is like a conversation around advocating for historic buildings with credibility versus advocating for historic buildings without credibility.
Right.
If you go into it and you know your facts and you are able to present that, you're going to seem so much more credible to elected officials, planning commissions, historic preservation commissions, etc. And if you go in there and you don't know what you're talking about and you're just running off of emotion, people are going to pick up on that, and your credibility sinks, and then the movement's credibility starts to sink.
Right.
So it's important when we're advocating for this that we actually make sure that we know what we're talking about and we have that credibility.
Right. Now, because this was an historic theater, it doesn't make the building any less important to have saved, because there was a ton of history. And you go back and look at Rachel's posts and see how important that building was. But unfortunately, the decades of sitting there without being anyone living in it, without anyone upkeeping it, again, there were fires that happened in there, like small fires, but the vandalism that happened as well. And unfortunately, it really just became this eyesore to some people, but other people, it became community art space. It became an a space for activism. So you kind of have to look at it both ways, right?
Yeah, and I think another thing that hurt this place too was the false facade the false front facade that was on there.
If people
It
could
was-
have seen what was behind there.
If you look at Rachel's photos that she posted, we actually got a glimpse of the original facade as the building was coming down. And I think we talked about this in our last recording that didn't work out.
Yes,
But-
this is, by the way, people, this is the second time we're recording
Yeah.
this episode because the first time we had some major technical difficulties.
Yeah. But last time we talked about this, we actually mentioned that we should keep a lookout to see if we get a glimpse of that facade because we thought it would still be there. And it was. And it was a really pretty building under there. And I think that is just another layer to that story of like, the times this building went through and what it meant to people. It also went through that post-World War II era where it was probably covered up, or mid-century. And then as that aged, and we were just talking about this on Main Street, because there's another building on Main Street going through this, it's still standing. But it looks very old and dated, and people just think it's a flat, ugly building.
Right.
But underneath that skin, man, there's layers, and this building had it. And I think that's what makes buildings like this really interesting,
Right.
is once you know that what a false front facade is, and you can identify them, and you're a preservationist, you look around you and you're just like, oh, I wonder what that building really
Yeah.
looks like underneath it.
Yeah.
Because
Well-
it tells a different story.
And what was interesting about the Yardstick Building, when it was being demolished, I was doing a documentary process. I was thinking of it as an archaeological excavation in my head, where you are excavating and you're revealing part of the past, but through excavation, that's also a destructive process.
Right.
So you need to record as you go. So the first thing that I noticed was that modern facade wasn't even attached to the original facade, not really. There was about a foot.
It was just
Of
like a
space.
floating.
Yeah. And so it would have been so easy to have removed that modern facade and really reveal that beautiful original details. But also in that demolition process, there were clawfoot tubs that were still present, little corner sinks, as part of the bachelor quarters. And then I would see little details like wallpaper and crown moldings and some of the original wood-framed windows. I actually had to go borrow a bigger lens from my husband
to get a close-up.
so I could zoom in because I was looking at the building from across the street in a parking structure,
Yeah.
which just provided a great overview. But yeah, I had to upgrade my lens so I could get those details of the wallpaper.
And we're glad you did because those little snippets give you insight into the building, right? Like, and then you can imagine people living there.
Yeah.
And you can put yourself in that building. And that's when I think we make those connections to a building that, because all of your posts on Instagram, and we shared some of them, we did some of our own, they did really well. And I think that people just really enjoyed that peak.
Yeah. And I love that you just mentioned like the clawfoot tubs and the sinks. And also one of the things you mentioned in your post was the doors and how fabulous a shape they were in, the interior doors.
Yes.
And that they should have been salvaged and that we lost that. And that stood out to me because in the photos, I mean, it was impressive to see
Right.
how good a shape some parts of that interior still was.
Oh, and salvaging from historic buildings is a completely other episode.
Yeah.
Because that we could really delve into and the reasons why other cities do it really well and why we don't do it really well.
And there's so much interest in it here in Salt Lake. I get so many comments about, I would have taken those doors.
Right.
I would have taken those tubs.
Yeah.
They're just going to end up in the landfill.
Where
it's such
yeah.
a waste.
Yeah. We really do need a salvage shop.
The demolition of the La France, I had seen a perfect vintage Pyrex bowl.
Right? You're like, no!
Like, and people can't go in and salvage those things because it is private property and it is a trespassing offense.
So it takes again, and we talked about this in our post, we got to go beyond the city leaders. We've got to take it to our state leaders. If we could get some legislation allowing the salvaging of from historic buildings, and then if anyone listening would like to open a salvage store,
a nonprofit
salvage store, where this could live, and then I think maybe that would be my grandiose idea that would be a jumping off point of people like buying an old house and saying, instead of wanting it to look like the Property Brothers came in and redid it.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if the Habitat for Humanity's Rehouse store would be interested.
Now that's interesting.
Yeah,
it's hard to know. So in Baltimore, Brick and Board is a wonderful story of a nonprofit that started as just salvaging from historic properties, especially West Baltimore. If you've ever been to West Baltimore, it's, it used to be a white, affluent neighborhood, and then once it was integrated, white flight happened. All the white people moved out, and then it became quickly a black neighborhood, but it was de-invested in. All the stores moved out, and it's just rows and rows of townhomes, like historic.
But those cool townhomes that people love, right?
They're very cool. And I've done several tours down there for historic preservation. And I was lucky enough to talk to Brick and Board, who goes in there, and when the city says this is beyond repair, and there's so many that are beyond repair that just have no roof, and Baltimore's wet, humid. And Brick and Board goes in there and gets the wood out of it, the doors, and the windows, whatever they
can, right?
Yeah, and what they do is they take it back to their warehouse. They will put the boards through like a mill, and they'll resurface them, and then they'll resell them, and it's a wonderful example of what can be done with care.
Right.
And they, I think, I could be wrong on this, but I don't think they're a nonprofit anymore. I think they're now a for-profit because they've done so well doing this.
Oh, wow.
And it would be interesting to get them on the show. I know they've done podcasts before.
That'd be cool to hear their story and see.
I asked them when I talked to them. I was a bit concerned about these houses coming down, and I asked them if people in the neighborhood had actually, had they talked to people in the neighborhood when they're doing this, and they said yeah, and they, those areas are so de-invested in that the neighborhood actually is sad to see them go, but at the same time is happy that they're going and somebody is keeping the material so it can be reused elsewhere. And so it's a very mixed emotion thing, but they said overwhelmingly people, because they know they're on the scene, people are grateful for that.
Right, yeah.
And I think that would be helpful here, a model like that.
Well, that's what I was thinking, I know, Chris, you own a historic home, and Rachel, you own a historic home.
I do.
I own a 1969 Rambler, so
it's getting there.
It's getting there. And for everyone else who buys one, if they had an option to go and find period appropriate items for their house, materials, would they be more likely, instead of going to Home Depot and putting in, all white, would they be interested in a salvaged yard to go and buy period appropriate details instead?
And it's not just a historic preservation issue. This is an environmental sustainable issue.
Amen, man.
Yeah.
If you don't have to cut down more trees to make a door, part of the core emphasis of environmental sustainability is recycle and reuse.
Recycle, reuse.
Right? And you've got to think of our landfill as a finite resource. It will run out of room.
Yeah.
And especially if we're just putting a bunch of construction waste in there, it fills up so quickly. So you've got to treat that as a resource, and in order to sustain that availability of that landfill resource, you do need to start recycling a lot of this construction material. And this is something that is happening in federal agencies.
Oh, okay.
Because it's mandated by executive order in order to build green and to reduce waste. And so there's already models and methods and companies in place to help facilitate this. It just needs to be something that Salt Lake and the state of Utah is willing to say, this is what we want to do.
Yeah. Wow. We went a few different directions with that one.
Yeah, that took us, and we're only on the second one.
Well, the Yardstick is an important building.
It really
Yeah.
is.
It's interesting because it does bring up all of these specific topics.
Right. It does.
We just talked about several things. There could be several different episodes around preservation.
Stay tuned, people. We're
Yeah.
we're going to really dive into a lot of preservation issues in this.
Don't get me
next-
started on old growth wood.
A follower of mine pointed out, and it's on the west side, which is interesting because you probably haven't heard of it because it's on the west side. It was a house located at 1380 South, 900 West. It's called the Powell Dalton Home and was one of the kind of pioneering families of that area. It was on a large lot, and it had a mysterious fire recently, like maybe in the past month, and is now it's now been demolished. But the neighborhood was advocating for its preservation. But this brings up another issue, is that there's very few local landmarks and no local historic districts on Salt Lake's west side.
Right.
And so there was not a mechanism in place for the preservation of this home. Even though there were petitions signed and given to the city,
Yeah.
it was private property and no city ordinance.
Right.
And a mysterious fire.
And a mysterious fire.
Again.
That mysterious fire. All right, so we'll get to some of our buildings that are either in danger or to be demolished. We'll get to those in a little bit. Let's go on to a little something that Rachel likes to call still a parking lot. So these are buildings that were demolished and supposedly for new development, but no.
Right. The narrative that we're told for a lot of these buildings is that they need to be demolished right now because there's a plan for them and it's going to be great for the city. And yet here we are a few years later and nothing's happened with that lot. So the one that just kind of sticks with me is the La France apartment buildings.
That one guts me too.
Yeah, that's where that great little vintage Pyrex bowl
Yes.
was.
Oh.
But also, a lot of usable items, a lot of radiators,
Tile.
vintage bathroom
Right.
items. So that was demolished in September 2021.
Oh my gosh, it's been that long.
It's been that long, and it is literally a parking
It is
lot.
a parking lot.
Not even a good parking lot. It's a graveled
Right.
parking lot adjacent to the Greek Orthodox Church.
Which the Greek Orthodox Church had this huge deal about building this great plan, expanding places for their church. They were going to have mixed use development in there, and nothing has come about it.
Nothing's come about it. And when it was demolished, it was still low interest rates. That's when a lot of the building was happening. And so we could have still had those
Right.
very important, especially important for women's history, but it's in Old Greek Town as well.
Right. And those people that had lived there, some for 20, 30 years, could have still had their homes.
Yeah.
So it's also a displacement of an entire community.
Right. And affordable housing.
And affordable housing.
Definitely affordable.
And
yeah.
it was its own little micro community.
It was.
Because, it had these little alleyways or mid-block alleys.
With these
little
cool
courts.
little houses, and, you had the 3 buildings that had the apartments in them, and then those courts.
Yeah.
And, I heard from several listeners that lived there and talked about how devastating it was, and that some of the people that lived there ended up being homeless because there was no place for them to go.
Right.
And in seeing the demolition, we saw that a lot of stuff was left behind by some of these people, and it just makes you wonder if they left it behind because they had nowhere to take their stuff with them.
Right.
Yeah. This to me is an interesting narrative, and I've thought about it a lot since this came down. You talk to a lot of people that lived there 20, 30 years ago and how great of a place it was. And it was a place for placemaking
right.
For these people. And then it went through phases of neglect and then different types of people moving in that caused some issues for some people there and for the owners of it. But, that sort of stuff happens with neglect.
Yeah.
And the owners of this allowed that to happen.
They did.
And not only that, but it also feeds into this narrative of humanity. And if you're taking away affordable housing and especially if you're a church, this is what gets me.
I know.
Not only a church, but a Christian church, where the founding principles were based on humanity.
Yes.
Of Jesus' followers, supposedly. That you would take that away and you would just create a flat parking lot because you don't want to deal with people or you don't want to deal with the issues of this building.
You didn't want to do the upkeep. You didn't want to put money into it.
Yeah, you've lost that humanity narrative. And to me, it's a really sad story of where our capitalistic nature has taken us. And it's just something that has provided me with hours of thought and reflection on where are we headed as a community, a state, a city,
right?
You name it, a country.
I think,
and I wish leaders in these positions would think through this more.
It doesn't seem like the city got a fair deal, like a good trade-off.
Right.
If we're going to lose the historic buildings, we should get something better.
Get something in turn for it.
Yeah.
What else is still a parking lot, Rachel?
Well, this is a lake, and I'm sure everybody's seen Lake Sears.
It is now a seagull preservation habitat.
Yeah.
It was in the City Weekly.
It's the new Great Salt Lake.
And just the fact that there's now all these jokes about it, and I can say Lake Sears, and people know. Right. Again, it's just there was an urgency to tear down the Sears. And this was in November 2022.
Yeah.
There still isn't.
Nothing's done.
There's not a lot of movement there. There isn't a lot of movement for getting things through the Planning Commission or the City Council.
Mm-hmm.
So now we just have a green, semi-toxic lake in the middle of But yay for the seagulls having a place to go.
I mean, the taco stands are still there, so that's great.
Thank God for that.
I guess kind of in the same area as the old Deseret Mortuary.
Right.
Which was, I don't know, demolished 10 years ago. I don't even remember.
Yeah.
But that's still a parking lot.
That's still a parking lot. Oh, man, I knew somebody who worked at that mortuary and lived in the apartments that were attached.
And that was an old Victorian mansion. It had a modern facade on it, but if you went inside, it was a Victorian mansion.
Yeah. Mm. So there's also where Ichiban Sushi used to be.
Yeah, that one's a tough one for me. It just... I shake my head at that one. That's the old English Lutheran church. So it was an old church building that had been adaptively reused into a restaurant, a couple different restaurants there.
I remember when it was the Italian restaurant.
Yes, and everybody does. That's located, or it was located at 336 South, 400 East. It's adjacent to the old Oker School building. That was demolished in July 2021. And I heard supposedly that they're beautiful stained glass windows, that those were removed and preserved. But here we are several years later, and that sort of stuff ends up missing or broken.
And we've had that before, right?
But that was a beautiful building.
Yes, it was.
With old growth timbers. I mean, old growth timbers. It was built in an English church style with beautiful stained glass windows, and it was being used.
Yeah, there
was a profitable, popular business
Right, so we're not talking about a derelict, neglectful building. No.
And again, it was demolished, and we have a gravel. It's not even a parking lot.
It's just gravel.
It's just empty,
Yeah, it's just empty.
Wasn't there also 2 historic houses that went with it that also were demolished?
There was one Victorian house that was also demolished, also had been adaptively reused into an office building, also had a business located in it. So these were well-maintained historic buildings, no historic protections because they were not located in a local historic district or on the local register. And we were told there was an urgency.
Yes, as we always are.
That's the narrative, right?
Yeah.
We needed housing. We needed to build something. Yeah. And again, it's gone, and the city didn't get anything in return.
Yeah, this is an issue around that whole, and I coin it as like, Utah's probably one of the worst states for this, but it's progress at all costs, and it's almost like we don't care about these buildings. We need this now. We need this progress, and then that due diligence isn't done, or those deals aren't done, and then you end up with this, where people might have had the best of intentions, but really didn't have their due diligence or their business deals wrapped up completely, or their funding or whatever the excuse is. And then you end up with empty lots throughout your city. And, this has happened in cities across America, but Salt Lake City is definitely starting to see this happen more and more because of its growth.
Right.
And it's just, when does it end, and when do we as people, as a community, say, enough's enough? There should be protections in place to maybe check on the due diligence side more of these deals. I know that sounds like government overreach, and if people would be against that, certain groups of people, but it's still your community. You have to live in this community. You see it every day. And it also takes you away from your sense of place and your sense of belonging when these places vanish overnight, and then you're just stuck with empty landfill, basically. So
you also have on your list of some parts are still a parking lot and some parts are going to be demolished.
Yeah, there is a section along 200 East, and it's between 2nd and 3rd South. And this parallels Edison Street, which is the old Franklin Avenue. And you'll probably know that name because of Franklin Avenue Cocktails is in the old Franklin Theater. But this section of 200 East, there's been a bunch of buildings that have been demolished over the years, and soon to include the Ken Sanders, the old Ken Sanders building.
Yeah, he's now moved into the Leonardo, the basement of the Leonardo.
Yes. Again, it's supposedly going to be a new mixed-use housing development, but it's almost the entire length of this block.
Right, because earlier this year, one of the vacant office buildings, wait for it, had a fire.
Yes. And that building
was, I believe it has been demolished.
It has been. I saw it being demolished, I think maybe last week or 2 weeks ago. That's taken a few years to get to this point, but it is now just mostly empty and still threatening some historic buildings, including the old Ken Sanders, the Green Ant building.
Right.
Green Ant is still there, but other businesses have moved out because they were told it was going to be demolished.
Moving on to those that we know are going to be demolished and possibly will end up still being a parking lot this time next year. There was a big push in Murray City to save the Murray City Hall, which was a historic high school. And unfortunately, that push and that activism was not rewarded. And we are going to lose that important part of Murray history.
Yeah, and Murray's tough because it's lost so much of its historic architecture over the years.
And we're just we're talking about downtown Murray.
Yeah, the
right?
old
Murray corridor.
Right.
Yeah.
And from what I see of the proposed plans for the old Murray Municipal Building, it's, they're trying to so-called honor the history by building something that kind of looks historic, but that's just such an insult.
It really is.
It's like we acknowledge that this is an architecturally interesting building.
Or important to the history.
But we're not actually going to preserve it.
Yeah, but we're still going to demolish it and build something that kind of looks like it, and then we're going to say, hey, this was a win.
Right, and I see that in downtown Holiday as well.
Oh.
And I drive by it and it's trying to look historic, it's trying to have a clock tower, but it's not authentic. So what I wonder about is in 50 years, are these buildings that are supposed to kind of look historic, what are we going to think of those?
Yeah.
Are we going to say, oh, that's a cool old building? Or are we just going to look at it and
I wonder, I
see
wonder
it
that,
run?
I think
are
about
they
that
going
all
to
the
hold
time.
up through time? I don't know.
My prediction is I just don't think the material will age well.
I don't think it will age well. I think these are going up really fast.
Yeah.
They're not being built very well, and material that's not sustainable.
Well, I think you have to look no further than amusement parks to see how it's going to age.
Right.
Like Disneyland. Like the older Disneyland did not age well. And when I drive through Holiday now, downtown Holiday, I think they gave us a really shitty version of Disneyland. Like it's just it's just really ugly. And I know some people might enjoy that, but give it 10 years, 15 years, and it's just not going to age
That's
well.
how I feel about Murray. I grew up in Taylorsville, and so Murray, downtown Murray, was where we used to go. And, thank God they're saving the theater.
Yeah.
But what we've lost far outweighs, saving the theater. I mean, but I guess, we take our wins where we can because we're losing a lot of battles. If you want to figure out how to help Murray City, our friends at the Murray First Foundation, Murray First Historic Foundation.
Historic Murray First.
Thank you. Historic Murray First. Thank you. I knew I'd get it right. They're trying their hardest, and, go and give them a follow and see what you can do to help them out, because they were the ones that started the whole activism to save this municipal building. And
other, they're concerned about a lot of these historic landmarks in the area.
Yep.
So they're a good group.
And then we have another one that you just told us about today. And this makes me really sad because I love this building, Rachel.
Yeah, it's the old Ma Bell building, and you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. It is at the corner of 2nd East and 2nd South, and it is a very brutalist style building. There's no windows on the lower floors, and it was used to house the data center for the telephone companies. So Mountain Bell is what was out here, so often known as Ma Bell.
Yep.
And it was the second largest employer in the state, right after Kennecott at the time. It has an interesting kind of environmental sustainability history.
Amazing.
I mean, even though it was built in the 60s, the heat that was generated by these large computers at the time that were housed there was used, tunneled underground and used to heat an adjacent building. It has just a great history. It was built to be sturdy. It was built to house 15 stories above it.
Wow.
So there was a previous proposal that was going to reuse this building kind of as the concrete foundation
Of a
higher building, and that's what it was built for. But I was told recently by a city employee that it is now proposed for demolition and then redevelopment of that lot.
Now, I know brutalism isn't everyone's favorite, and there are a couple of other buildings around town that are built in that style, but I really like it. I'll go on record. I love brutalism. I think it's awesome.
Yeah, and a lot of brutalism is starting to make its way onto the National Register, and it's
Getting to be that age, 50 years.
Yeah, and some of it is actually aging well. I think it's the Boston City Hall it's a big brutalist structure, and there was years where people just hated it. And then, a couple of years ago, they started talking about demolishing it. And then people started talking about how great of a building it actually is and how, it's really impressive. And it's been saved. And I think that give brutalism its time.
Right.
There's some good brutalist buildings out there.
It just seems like this building was ripe for adaptive use.
Yeah, and there was a proposal. The previous folks that were going to redevelop that block were going to reuse it, and now just imagine that entire building fitting into our landfill. What does that do for the future of Salt Lake and sustainability? Does that mean that we have to then push further west for redevelopment of new landfill space?
Mm-hmm.
And is that the best use of Salt Lake's west side?
Right. Right. And is that the best use of our resources? That's a shame, because that would be a really cool adaptive use. Enough doom and gloom. Let's get on to some of our wins. Because for all the stuff that we lost over the last couple of years, man, we had some really great wins this year. Some really good stuff is coming down.
There's been some big things happening, luckily.
There has. There's been a lot of talk for quite a few years about the Wasatch Plunge building. And that's at 840 North, 300 West. And it was built in 1921. And it has been sitting vacant since the Children's Museum moved out and moved into Gateway. Oh, God, 20 years ago, maybe?
I think so. I mean, I remember going to the Children's Museum when I was a kid. That was one of my favorite places.
I remember taking my
go.
nieces there. Absolutely. And, a lot of people, it's really well seen. I mean, you drive on 300 West, you're going to see it. And it's been a worry for a lot of people for a lot of years.
And it's a city-owned building.
Yes.
That
it was going to be demolished. But we got some really good news this year.
Yeah, so first I just want to acknowledge the Warm Springs Alliance.
Oh.
Like, they have done a ton of work on this.
They
Sylvia
really
Nibley
have. Yes.
has been the constant.
Kudos to her for keeping that in the city's ear. I mean,
If you're a preservationist and you're looking for like a way to advocate for a building and a way of building a coalition around it, Sylvia has done a really good job at it.
Yes.
And so, kudos to them. The other thing is that the city stepped in and actually put $8 million towards this building this year. They voted on it, approved it. A lot of that was led up by my husband. He worked with people that were very concerned about it because it's right in his district. And he wanted to see it stand. And it's actually just right up the street from our house.
Yeah.
And one of my very first papers in historic preservation was actually done on the Wasatch Plunge building. I did a very in-depth building assessment on it. It has its problems. It has a lot of issues with moisture. And it's also one of the oldest cement buildings in Utah. Like, there's not very many cement buildings from 1921 still standing. And it's very impressive when you see the inside of it, especially the arches in there that are all cement pillars.
Gorgeous.
Or concrete. So when you drive by it now, I just drove by it yesterday. They're putting the new roof on it.
Oh, are
There's
they?
workers putting a new roof on it. That's where part of the $8 million is going towards. And they're also going to stabilize it.
Good.
So two big things that are happening with that. So work is underway. It's a huge win. We should be thankful that the city's investing in it. They want to see it used.
Yeah.
And also for nonprofits like the Warm Springs Alliance who have really kept it at the forefront.
Now, was that part of the voting initiative from, I think, last year for a bond?
The bond went towards, that was another thing that my husband helped push through. That went towards the parks.
Okay.
And that is also used to maintain historic structures at parks. And we'll talk a bit about that later with Allen Park.
Yeah. Now, the city is doing kind of reimagining the Warm Springs Park.
They are.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I've been working a little bit with the individual who's in charge of the Warm Springs Park and Richmond Park. And the city is reaching out to communities.
Mm-hmm.
And that Warm Springs area is important to their indigenous population.
Very.
And so she's reaching out to them. I know they've had site visits and ceremonies there.
They just had a ceremony a couple weeks ago.
Yeah. That area was home to a lot of Native Hawaiians, but that's also where the Indian agent lived there in the late 1800s. And so there was a lot of campsites there, even after the Mormons had arrived.
Yeah.
And use of those warm springs and the old Hot Springs Lake. That area, although it's become a little bit industrialized over time, it still retains a lot of that historic sacred place
Yeah.
space,
Right.
and as well as ties to the ancestors. There's so much what we would call archaeology there now that's been lost and destroyed through time, including burial sites.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I've often wondered because within historic preservation, you can do like cultural landscape designations. And this, I don't think it would fall under a traditional cultural landscape because it's still not used as it. It has to be continually used. But it would still qualify under a cultural landscape. And I wondered if the city ever had it designated as such, if there isn't government funding and grants they could go after to restore it. And to recognize the indigenous tribes from there, the Hawaiians also that used it, and even the settlers. It just, that requires a lot of time, a lot of money to also hire the right people to do that research and to get that pushed through. But it seems like even though they might not be going down that route, they're still going down the route of recognizing those cultures.
Yes.
And again, I think some of that goes back to the Warm Springs Alliance, where my early conversations with Sylvia was about recognizing all the cultures that used it. She was very keen on it, and I think that this has just been something that's been building, and I think you'll start to see more and more of it as this project goes on.
Right. And it's a very community-based grassroots effort.
Yeah.
And that's so much of what preservation is
Right.
recognizing and learning about the history of a place. And once you live in the area and you just kind of see these random buildings and I don't know what any of it means, but once you understand that backstory, it becomes so much more important to people.
Right.
Yeah.
It's not just about the brick and mortar of the building.
Yeah. And they're doing, to me, this is how you do preservation right on so many levels, because they're recognizing not only who built the area and like its more modern history, but they're recognizing layers before that. And they're trying to be inclusive with it without making it where the other layers are ignored.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important for preservation going forward. And I think that's where some preservation groups have gotten it wrong, where they only want to recognize one of those layers or maybe a couple and leave out the others. But like when you have that layering effect, that all matters to the history of that place
Yep.
and its importance for a community as a whole.
Right. Somewhat close to the Wasatch Plunge, we have the Fisher Mansion and the Carriage House. And this is at 1206 West, 200 South. This was built in 1893 for the Fisher family, which were one of the first. Albert Fisher, he was a prominent German brewer and the founder of Fisher Brewery.
Yeah, and it's right off of the Jordan River, and he cited it there specifically to use that river water. That property is also noteworthy because it's a West Side local historic site.
Right. And the house was designed by Richard Kledding, who designed the Capitol building along with just a ton of other buildings here. Really well-known architect. The Carriage House has been updated for adaptive use, and now the mansion is going to find some restoration.
Yeah.
Wasn't there something about that historic metal fence? It was stolen.
Yes, the metal fence outside was stolen and later found at a scrapyard.
Yeah. Yeah, I believe the story I was told by people in the know, and I tend to believe the people that told me this, was that David Amma, when he was over Preservation Utah, this happened when he was there, he actually he figured that it would end up in a scrapyard. And so David went to these scrapyards daily, and then finally it turned up, and he was able to get it back for the city.
Wow.
And the city has it in their possession. So, I mean, I don't know why he never talked about that when he was at Preservation Utah. It's such a win.
That's such a win.
Yeah. I mean,
thanks for your hard work on that, David.
Yeah. And also talk about your wins.
Talk about your wins, man.
But yeah, and from my understanding, there has, the Friends of the Fisher Mansion are working on the mansion restoration. There's also been some funds put to it, but it's really escaping my mind how much.
Fisher Mansion is a really good example to show people it takes time.
Yes.
Because a lot of people, we post about these things, or you hear in conversations, well, nothing's moving on it. It's just been sitting there. Where's all this money that it got, and why isn't it being used? This takes time.
Yeah, and government contracts take time.
Right.
Goodness gracious, they take time.
And in the meantime, Friends of Fisher Mansion and Fisher Brewery have done quite a few events on the lawn outside it to, show people what it is, what's going to happen, what's moving forward. So there are things that are happening, but it takes time, and we need to have patience.
Yeah, they've done a good job at while it's going through these paces, that it's being used as like a community gathering place,
Right.
And I think that's really smart. But like you said, it does take time. We also live in a state where the state totally controls the purse strings to what cities can tax and how much they can tax. And they've done this intentionally, is so the cities here are basically at the beck and call of the state. And, Salt Lake can only tax and do so much. And they still have to supply services across the city that actually, personally, day-to-day interact with people.
Right.
Whether it be roads, power, et cetera, you name it. And so, the city has finite resources to do this, and when they do it, it is a big undertaking, and it really does take a long time.
It takes time.
Yeah.
But know what's happening.
Right. It's just the fact that it's part of the conversation that the city is having about not only the historic buildings that the city owns, but also looking at other historic buildings. It's a huge win that even it's part of the conversation.
Yeah.
Right.
And a lot of that is due to the voters
Yep.
demanding that it be part of the conversation. And not this past election cycle, but one previous to that, I had just done a quick research graphic on which of the candidates talked about historic preservation and which of them didn't.
Right. I remember that.
And there was still a good maybe 50% of the people who had recognized it as an issue in their campaign. It may not have been the most important issue, but it was still part of the conversation. And that is so important that it's already part of the conversation.
Yeah. Yep. We also have Allen Park at 1328 Allen Park Drive. It's in Sugar House. It was developed between 1931 and 1960. And it was right there on the verge of being demolished for
housing development. Now, people will know this as Hobbitville.
Hobbitville, yes. And many urban legends surrounding this.
It's near Westminster College on 1300 East.
I lived the next street over from it for about a year, and the neighborhood peacock was always out and about.
Mm-hmm. And they're still there. There's still two peacocks there.
Yep. And I think that it's important to say that, like, this, we almost lost this.
Oh, it was.
Absolutely.
It was almost a pretty much done deal.
Yeah, you want to know some of the background on that?
Oh, spill the beans, Chris.
The city kind of swooped in at the last minute.
Well, so what happened with this, the city was actually involved at the beginning, and then they were taken out of the picture. So what happened was the owners of this originally went to the city and were like, we're thinking about selling this. We want this price for it. And I can't remember. It was like it was a very high price. And the city was like, we can't afford that. That's just, we can pay this much for it. And they said, well, okay, well, then we're going to go to a developer. This developer said they'll pay this much. And then, when they started talking to the city, to this developer, the family quickly learned that the developer was just going to wipe everything off the map. And it was just going to be like gross townhomes.
Oh, it was going to fit as many townhomes as possible.
Well, and they were going to be high end, right?
Yeah.
Because Immigration Creek runs right through there.
Right.
So it was going to be, that area that was kind of already somewhat accessible to people, at least people who were visiting folks, and that it was then going to become closed off and very exclusive.
Yes.
Very much like other areas further east.
Right. And because it dips down and the houses next to it are above it. So, it could have been that the people living in these houses were looking into the third floor of these apartment buildings. You're in your backyard, you're looking into the third floor of the townhouse that just got built right next to your house.
And it would have destroyed so much of that natural space.
Well,
those trees would have been gone.
There was a lot of issues with the spring, with the river in development.
So this family, God bless them, they came back apparently, from what I'm told, to the city and was just like, we don't want to lose this, and this is like, we'll take a hit. We will reduce the price if you'll buy it, and you'll keep it.
Nice.
As a park. And it was really, this family could have made so much more money, like a ton more money.
Oh, yeah.
But they did the right thing.
They did.
And we should be thankful for that family, but we should also be thankful for the city stepping in.
That stepped in and recognized the historic value and the green space value.
Right.
Right?
Yeah. The green space, I think, is really one of the more important things here. One Allen Park was a residential community. It had these smaller homes that were brought in, like mining cabins, and they were small.
Yeah.
And that meant that they were rented at affordable rate.
Yep.
To the extent that several archaeology students lived there in the...
I knew a few.
Yes, I did too. It was this nice little archaeology enclave for a little while.
Yes.
So, I visited several of those homes. But because they had a small footprint, they were kind of like a green build. They had a lot of this green space, which is why it was a bird sanctuary.
Right.
But there were footbridges that you would need to get to some of the apartments. So that left that natural landscape intact.
And it's quite a slapdash little area,
Yeah.
but really eclectic and very, very cool.
Yeah, and go visit it.
It's open to the public?
It is open to the public. I was there, I think, a month or two ago, taking some photographs.
And now they're getting to the point of, unfortunately, there are some buildings that are just beyond saving.
Yeah, there's a couple there that are smaller
And we understand that. But for the greater, the bigger part of it, there's now going to be starting a lot of stabilization going on, a lot of restoration.
Yeah, that's part of that $11 million in, not grant, what was it? Bond that was passed this last year and voted on, was that a lot of that money is going to go to parks like this, and the Allen Lodge is going to get roof repairs and stabilization. And also there is plan for preservation of several of the houses there that that can be preserved and maintained.
So, and I mean, isn't that great that, again, preservation is part of this overall community discussion?
Yes.
And that the voters said, we want the city to preserve the buildings, the historic buildings that it owns.
Right.
Yeah. Well, and this also has, again, that multi-layering effect. It's community well-being. It's green space.
Right.
The green space helps bring about that community well-being. Is also historic preservation, place remembrance. There's just so many aspects to this little area.
Yeah.
I mean, you talk to anybody that grew up in Salt Lake,
Hobbitville.
and they have a story, whether it's true or not. They have a story of this place.
The hobbits that lived there, the witches that lived there, the Satanists that lived there, and in reality, it was just a bunch of archaeology students from the University of Utah.
We should call it Archaeologyville. My goodness.
So thankful. And I believe that is the city still taking comment on what to do with Allen Park, or has that ended now?
I think that's recently ended.
Yeah, I think so.
And the announcement of how to proceed has been done.
But we're gonna be able to, as a community, enjoy that area. And we can still have our lore about it, which is even more fun, because now we can take our kids there, and say, hey, when we were young, this is what we thought was going on here.
And that's exactly what I did with my kid. We had a family outing. Mm-hmm. It was a family photography outing. I had my camera, he had his camera, and we were just going around and photographing some of the tile artwork and the architecture, and I was like, back in my day.
You put on your glasses and grabbed your cane, and back in my day. But I love that. I love that so much about that. So yes, big kudos to the community and the city and the previous owners.
Yeah, and family outing. There's so many little family outings that have to do with historic preservation.
Right? Oh, yeah. It's a fun, go visit. It's a fun little way to spend a couple hours of your day.
Same with the International Peace Garden. Again, a historic space.
Yeah, that is so cool.
Absolutely.
That is a community asset, and, downtown families.
Yep.
Fun activity.
Okay, and this one came up on our radar. This is the E.L.T. Harrison House. It is at 10 West 300 North. It was built in 1874. It's located in the Capitol Hill Historic District, so local district. But it came up on our radar because it was for sale.
Yes.
And Chris, I know you posted it on your
Historic Home Salt Lake. Yeah,
there you go. Nice plug. But it did sell, and then the neighbors saw a fence go up around it. And we all know what that means. I mean, every time, no matter where you drive around, a fence goes up around something, the first thing you're going to think is that building's coming down. And the neighbors were like, wait a minute. Yeah. Something's not right here.
I don't think that, I don't think a fence actually went up.
It went up. It's on Google.
It did.
It's on Google Street View.
Yeah, the fence went up.
May 2022.
And I
was told by another neighborhood it was just the crews were out there.
And that was the other indication. I think there was actually maybe some equipment came up on site or something, but the neighbors were like, wait a minute. And I know you even got a little involved in this. City council was called.
Historic Landmarks Commission. I had several people reach out to me, and they were like, there's crews on the property. It is under contract to be demolished. I reached out to my representative on the Historic Landmark Commission, who answered the phone by asking me why I was calling her. If you're on the Historic Landmark Commission and I ever call you and you answer the phone that way, it's not going to be a pleasant conversation. Don't do it. I'm calling you because it's important.
Right.
And also, so are the people in that area.
In your district.
Yeah. But after we got through the muck of that, I was able to get more information from her on who to contact. And I was able to contact the person at their office. And got them the realtor's name, the address, also sent them the listing so they could research it. And they had said that several neighbors had also called and were very concerned. So this quickly snowballed into a neighborhood issue where the community was very concerned about it. And, rightfully so. It's a very unique building.
Yes.
And also the architect had quite an impact in downtown Salt Lake City.
Absolutely. Can you imagine if you were both the realtor and the person who bought this house, and all of a sudden your phone is just blowing up with people saying, "Wait a minute."
Oh, it made me laugh when it went back up for sale in the in the seller's notes. It said, "Do not submit an offer for demolition." Yeah, I was just like, "Thank God."
So kudos to the neighborhood for keeping an eye on stuff. And this is one of the good things about knowing that you live in a local historic district.
Yeah,
is knowing what can and can't happen. And when you see things that are going on that aren't quite right, you know that you have that backup to say, this can't happen.
Yeah. And I live in this Central City local historic district. And that also includes Trolley Square and the Western Gardens parcel.
Right.
And Wasatch Community Garden Center. And there's been multiple development proposals that have come through. And there's been a lot of adaptive reuse implemented in that local historic district.
Yes.
While still maintaining kind of its historic status and character.
Right.
And the thing about the south side of the Central City Historic District, which is important, is that there's a lot of multifamily homes in that area. It was actually more part of the more affordable parts of the city when it was developed. And so it's definitely not these grand mansions along South Temple.
Right.
It's a little sliver of the city that's more representative of everyday people.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah, the ELT Harrison House is actually a smaller structure. It's like 2,000 square feet.
Yeah, it's not that
house.
big, but it's so unique.
Yeah, its architectural style is unique for Salt Lake. It is Italianate, and there's not a lot of Italianate buildings here. The National Register has it as Victorian and secondary style Italianate. I would argue they're wrong on that. To me, when you look at it, it's Italianate through and through. But people call it the Castle House because it is Italianate style, but it has a lot of stone.
Yes.
And so it has because of that stone, it's a very unique facade. And it does look a bit like a little castle sitting on Capitol Hill.
It does.
So it's a very unique house.
Do you know if it's still up for sale? I meant to check.
Last I looked, it was not. Try and jog my memory. I look at so many houses.
Yeah,
I think it was sold, but nothing's happened to it.
Nothing's happened to it. But at least it's not going to be demolished.
Well, it's something to watch for. Because if it was sold, nothing's happening to it.
Oh, yeah, those mysterious fires.
Are we talking demolition by neglect in 10 years or whatever?
Right. No,
because it is prime property.
It is. Oh, yeah.
Overlooks the valley.
Yeah. The next one is one that Chris and I, we this was our first episode with you as new co-host. This is the
yeah.
Kramer House at 241 Floral Street. It was built in 1890. It is one of the oldest single-family residences still standing in downtown Salt Lake City. And what's really great about it is that it was incorporated into this was an RDA.
Yeah. Yeah, so like the city owned this house at one point. And when they sold it for this project, they in the contract said that this has to stand, that it's a historic structure. If whatever happens with this land, it has to be incorporated into it.
And that's an interesting little tidbit because it's on the National Register.
Yeah.
It is.
But it is not a local historic landmark.
Yeah.
So this was a way for the city to mandate preservation without it having to go through that process of listing.
Yeah.
Right.
It was really smart by the city. And
It was.
You know, it's sort of a smaller structure, so it's easier to get away with it, right? It's not a huge building.
Yeah.
And
it wasn't an inconvenience to the developer.
Yeah. And, you know, when I first started talking about this with people in the know around it, I was very impressed that the city had this foresight to be like, you know, we need to make sure this is preserved. It's the only house downtown.
So it's been incorporated into the Astor, which is a mixed-use apartments, and some of those apartments are affordable housing.
Yes, certain percentage.
Yeah.
And it's going to be the Water Witch 2 bar?
Yeah, last we heard.
Yeah.
Now, who was the first occupant? Was that Kramer?
That was Mr. Kramer and his floral shop. He was actually the one that built that. If you want to go back... I'm not always good at keeping track of what episode number things are, but we did. Chris and I did an episode, so if you want to go back and listen to the history of the Kramer House, it's kind of a fun little listen.
Either 27 or 28.
Something like that,
Yeah. And what's interesting about the Kramer House, from my point of view, is that it's so close to Edison Street.
And that's what we were going to get to next.
Yeah, the old Franklin Avenue.
So Franklin Avenue is just one street east of Floral.
So Floral is a mid-block alley, and Edison Street is a mid-block alley.
Yep, they back each other.
They do. And what's important about this section of Edison Street between 200 and 300 South is that it's the old Franklin Avenue, and that was just the center of Black American community in Salt Lake City, it starts about 1870, but the heydays really are the late 1880s to about the 1920s. And, you know, when we talk about these enclaves in Salt Lake, we have Old Greektown, we have Japantown, we have Chinatown, Plum Alley.
Sweet, yeah.
And there's not many of these that really remain.
Right.
So Plum Alley, for example, the old Chinatown, is completely gone. There's nothing left.
Yeah.
You know, there's a few buildings here and there located in Japantown, Greektown, Swedetown. But Edison Street has been overlooked for some miraculous reason.
Yeah, that's a huge miracle, especially where it exists, where everything around it has been demolished and rebuilt.
Everything around it. Yep,
I think it's the mid-block access issue.
I think it is.
Yeah.
And so Ken Sanders, Rare Books, his old building backs up along Edison Street. And so, everything around it's been demolished. Everything around the Kramer House has been demolished.
Yeah, the Kramer House is the only original building left on Floral Street.
Yes. So this is a place to watch because everything around it is being demolished and redeveloped. But there still are a number of important historic buildings along this section. I always call it Franklin Avenue.
Yeah.
And so there was a transition in 1906 where the city kind of rebranded the area. So the name was changed from Franklin Avenue to Edison Street, and the attempt really was to push out the Black residents and make it a white business corridor. But that 1906 date is very important. So there still are a number of pre-1906 buildings in that area, the most prominent being the old Franklin Avenue Theater, which is where the Warhol Lofts are, as well as the Franklin Avenue Cocktails. So that is from the 1800s. It is part of the old Franklin Avenue days. And there are a number of other historic structures in there as well. And so there's no protection for any of these buildings. They're not local historic landmarks. They're not in a local historic district. The Guthrie Building is a local historic landmark. So that one is preserved. It is part of that timeline as well. But
it kind of gives hope that if the Floral House was saved and the Guthrie House, is still standing, that the buildings along Edison Street, Franklin Avenue.
Yeah, and telling the story of the importance of this street, I think, is really going to be key.
Getting the history right and letting people know the importance of it through the history.
And those restaurants and those businesses in that area have been phenomenal. So we've got the Franklin Avenue Cocktails. There's another restaurant called the Mayor Voss, which is named after the unofficial mayor of Franklin Avenue, H.H. Voss. He was also the first Black person to be a part of the Utah legislature. He wasn't elected. He was an officer of the legislature. He was appointed by bringing in the Black voters to the Republican Party at the time. So he was given an honorary position as doorman, which was the lowest possible position. But he was still, that was 1906. So fairly early on.
Okay.
And his picture as part of the Utah legislature, it's 1903. I'm sorry. Anyway, it's all been preserved at the Utah Capitol. There's a whole backstory to it.
Nice. But I love the fact that the businesses on the street are embracing the history and telling it and getting that word out about it.
Yes, and I think that's going to be so important because once you understand the importance of that block, it makes it harder for a developer to come in and just demolish everything.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, it's just old. There's nothing there, right?
Right.
Well, no, there's
a huge amount there.
And it's such an important part of Salt Lake's history that's not told. So you can go around and take a walking tour of Salt Lake's historic buildings, and they're mostly white mining moguls.
Yes.
There's the Judge Building, which is a white woman mining mogul. Okay, that's great. And then there's the that Jewish corridor with the Brooks Arcade. So that's nice, but there's not a lot of other diversity.
Right.
And that's such a problem with Salt Lake's image, right? Is that, there's no Black people there.
Right.
There's why would anybody want to move there? Because it's just all with this white Mormon enclave. Well, that is not true. That hasn't been true.
Right.
Even before Salt Lake City was settled as Salt Lake City, there were Black explorers in the area.
Right. Right.
So I'm very passionate about
Yes.
this issue.
And we're going to have Rachel on in the coming year to talk more about Utah's Black history.
Yeah, I think that's good.
Yeah.
So I know quite a bit about Ogden's. I haven't had a whole lot of time to research Salt Lake City's.
Right.
But I mean,
and we're going to delve more into Ogden's as well. We kind of touched on it.
Yeah.
I did an episode with Chris about a year or two ago.
It's in 2022.
Yeah. So we're going to delve into that more. You're going to notice a shift with the podcast and talking not necessarily just about buildings, but we're going to be talking more about the cultural landscape. We're going to be talking more about communities and people and areas and how that all ties into preservation. So
Yeah.
I'm excited for that to come.
We're going to stop there for now. Join us for episode 32 as we finish our discussion with Rachel. Huge thanks for her for joining us today. I'll put links for how to find both her and Adrienne in the show notes. This podcast was researched and written by myself, Chris, Rachel, and Adrienne, and is produced by Mike Gillen. You can find us at Demolished Salt Lake Podcast on Instagram and Facebook and Threads, and also on Twitter at Demolished SL Pod, where we post pictures of places we talk about on the episode, as well as a lot of other content. And with that, we will see you next time.